Hello, ohayo gozaimasu, and irashaimase. I mentioned when I provided my belated and all too brief overview of the career of Shinoda Masahiro following his passing in March of this year that I wanted to follow up said video with a more detailed look at different films in his career, different eras in his career, and in general explore his great, to my mind, undervalued body of work in some more detail. And with that in mind, I intend to follow up this video with a look at his 1979 film Demon Pond, or more properly, I wish to compare and contrast said 1979 film with a more recent film, not quite a remake, rather a reworking of the original 1913 play upon which Demon Pond is based by the cult auteur Miike Takashi, famous in the West for his extreme films, his Asia extreme films, films like Ichi the Killer and perhaps most infamously Audition. These two films say quite a lot about their respective directors, the respective eras in which they were made, and they can be compared and contrasted quite fruitfully. So where Shinoda's film opens out Izumi Kyoka's original play, including special effects sequences and a more cinematic narrative that can follow different subsets of characters and elaborate on their stories and their points of view. Miike's film, or more properly, Miike's filmed version of an updating of the original play, which retains the theatrical setting, the fact that it is unfolding as a play, was filmed in front of a live audience, in some ways condenses the material and uses the more limited, I don't say that pejoratively, and claustrophobic sort of confines of the theatre and the more traditional sense of a unitary evocation of time and space. So without further ado, let me take you on a journey to the mountains, to a rural village, to an old and haunting myth, and to the way of life of people for whom tradition and social expectation rule all. Come with me to Demon Pond. Okay, so to get us started, a few very brief words about the time when the original play was written, 1913. This is a particular year with no special significance in and of itself, but it does mark something of a period of transition in Japan. The Meiji Restoration that had begun in 1868 and which led to all kinds of nationwide sweeping changes, the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, the end of Japanese sort of global isolation, the dismantling of old feudal practices, the end of the samurai as a social caste, the beginnings of industrialization, and many more changes. This led until 1912, when the Emperor Meiji died and was succeeded by the Emperor Taisho, thus beginning in 1912 the Taisho era, which was a period marked by democracy, by a very open liberalization of the country. And it is in the, as I said, the transitional period from Meiji to Taisho, when Japan was digesting still a host of sweeping changes and, in a sense, looking forward to others, that the original play of Demon Pond was written and produced. It is worth stressing at the outset that Izumi Kyoka was something of an outlier. something of an alienated figure almost in Japanese theatre in the early part of the 20th century, throughout the 1900s and the 1910s. He worked to a large extent against the norms of prevalent types of theatre such as shinpa and shingeki, which were derived from more contemporary settings and stories, and which featured more quote unquote realism in terms of acting, set design, as a way of distinguishing them from the classical Japanese theatre, the very stylized climates of No and Kabuki. As a novelist, I think Izumi Kyoka's work had been and would go on to be adapted for Shinpa theatre, but his theatrical output, exemplified by Demon Pond, flew in the face of the realism of Shinpa and Shingeki, and his proclivities were towards the magical, the romantic, the mysterious, the ghostly. Indeed, he incorporated much more of the perceived older forms of particularly kabuki than he did ground himself in contemporary forms and expressions in theatre. He has actually been seen as something of a forerunner, something of a godfather even, of contemporary Japanese horror, or so-called J-horror, that his themes, the characters that he presents, the stories that he tells, all look forward to J-horror. Indeed, if one looks at the prevalence of narratives and characters drawn from folk tales in both Izumi's theatre and in the work of such contemporary J-horror directors as Nakata Hideo or Shimizu Takashi, to name only the two most internationally visible and successful filmmakers in this genre, one can see a strong connective tissue, if you like, a connecting thread between two mediums and between several different artists. In particular, the recourse to ghosts, to what are known in Japanese folklore as yurei, and in particular the avenging spirit, the onryo. This is something that animates Izumi as it animates Ringu and The Grudge. So this connective thread, this common provenance in folk tales, in kabuki, in horror, in the fantastical, the mysterious, positions Izumi as, I think, a more significant figure with regard to Japanese cinema than has generally been allowed, or that many critics have generally allowed for. With this particular style, with this particular mode of theatre, I think it's fair to say that Izumi was not overly influenced by and didn't engage too much with contemporary Japanese society. However, society and politics do make their way into his work, as in various ways they would in the two key adaptations that I'm considering here. Okay, so even though neither Shinoda nor Miike have much in the way of horror in either of their adaptations of Demon Pond, this is not actually to suggest that both films are cut from the same generic cloth, as it were. And one of the primary ways of comparing and contrasting the two productions is to think about how they approach tone and how their narratives are structured. A lot of the differences pertain to, as I've already alluded, differences between the cinema and theatre and the storytelling and narrative norms of both mediums. But there are also quite a few tonal discrepancies between Shinoda's film and Miike's stage production, which is filmed and which is edited in a way that suggests something of the typical sort of norms of cinematic editing, illusionist classical cinematic editing. This sense of a tonal discrepancy actually comes down to a difference between what is in Shinoda's film played as a kind of shimmering crystalline mystery, whereas in Miike's film, at least for the first two acts thereof, comedy is the prevalent sort of genre. The comedy of Miike's film is something that arises almost from a kind of distillation effect. What Miike and his writers have done in their updating their adaptation of the play is, in effect, to transpose the narrative as if they were adapting it for cinema, and then to kind of retranspose that adaptation back into the medium of the theatre, much as distillation is concerned with evaporating liquid and then returning to a liquid state. So what we get is a kind of distillation of some of the key facets of the play, some of the key characters and their interactions and the narrative situations that buttress these interactions, and then a presupposition that a foreknowledge of the play will lead to certain expectations and certain presumptions about what happens, that then, when this is sort of retransposed back into theatre, can be played in a way that challenges or probes these presumptions or presuppositions. This sense on Miike's part of distilling what people know about Demon Pond, what they expect from Demon Pond, and then playing on these presuppositions is in evidence from the very beginning of the film. It starts in a very different way to Shinoda's film. In Shinoda's 1979 film, there is a very protracted opening sequence following the traveller, who will remain the central character throughout this film, even though there are large stretches where he's off screen, as he makes his way through the mountains to ultimately come across the maiden and be reconnected with his old friend. In Demon Pond Mark II, in Miike's Demon Pond, we begin with the maiden washing in the river or the stream outside of her house. And there is a long scene that departs quite a lot from the original play, in which the sort of daily lives and the feelings between her and her husband are extolled. And then the traveller almost kind of stumbles into this scene. So it's almost as though we view the same material from two different perspectives in these two different versions of the story. Part of the comedy then is based on disruption, on this sense of a disruptive presence that is destabilizing our views of the particular narrative that we are seeing unfold. The casting is very key here. I think the cast of Miike's Demon Pond are very young, almost like teen idol actors. There are no notable presences other than the traveller being played by Matsuda Ryohei, whose father, Matsuda Yusaku, was a very big, very iconic sort of tough guy movie actor in Japan in the 1970s and early 1980s. His presence as the traveller, as the character who, as I said in Shinoda's film, is kind of like the audience touchstone, the audience's window onto this magical other world, is reduced in this film. There's a strange tension between having a recognisable star on the one hand and having a role that is almost tokenistic, that is very little developed on the other. Now, one could argue that it is precisely because of this reduced role of the traveller that casting a star, a recognisable face, makes sense, because it lends some kind of substance through people's familiarity with him, with his on-screen persona, to a character who would otherwise remain quite vague, quite nondescript. I think more telling is the way that he, as I said, kind of stumbles into the narrative. And although he's not in any way a bumbling figure, the comedy derives from his sense of being, forgive the pun, a fish out of water. So, although Miike's conception of the traveller forecloses any sense that he is an audience surrogate or the character through whom the events of the film are focalised, nonetheless, it is his perennial sense of bemusement, initially at least quasi-comically, and later on with increasing horror as developments like the sacrifice of the maiden begin to take shape, that in a way guides our journey through the film. And this sense of a gradually darkening narrative is something that I think very much sets apart Miike's Demon Pond from Shinoda's. Shinoda's, although, as I've said, retains the sense of a mystery, something to be explored, something to be uncovered throughout its narrative, its tone, despite some broad comedy segues, particularly with a pair of characters who are part of the other kingdom, the sort of magical kingdom, and a more developed sense of the romance between the maiden and her husband, who is remaining in the village to ring the bell. The tone is fairly consistent throughout Miike's Demon Pond, although the various relationships that are explored in detail and are quite moving in Shinoda's film are not quite so in this dramatization. The friendship between the traveller and his long lost friend, the marriage between the friend and the maiden, these are all sketchy and vague, I think, in Miike. And the whole drama, the whole thrust of the narrative seems, at least towards the end, to weigh heavy on the shoulders of these, as I've said, ostensible teen idol performers. It feels a little bit like characters performing roles. It feels like they are acting out a drama rather than embodying it. Even given all this, I think what is useful is that sense of estrangement that comes from Miike's slight reordering of the structure and his sort of abstraction of the characters. It makes us kind of question what we're seeing more, rather than in Shinoda's film, what happens is that we have a kind of received wisdom. We have more rounded characters, but there's little questioning of what they represent. This is particularly interesting because the traveller in Shinoda's film is ultimately quite problematic in the sense that he espouses a point of view to his friend that is ultimately proved to be incorrect. He urges his friend to leave his wife and to return with him to Tokyo and to civilization. So, although at the beginning of the narrative of Shinoda's film, the traveller is smitten with the maiden, with how alluring she looks, she is played by the famous theatrical onagata, or female impersonator, Tamasaburo Bando, who also plays the princess as well. He ultimately comes around to the view that she is to be treated with suspicion, that she is going to lead his friend down a path that is going to be problematic. And although this is ultimately proved to be the case technically, when the rest of the village impinge on the existence of these characters and stress the need for a sacrifice, I think what we feel strongly about in Shinoda's film is the weight of the relationship between these two figures. And given this weight, this substance, including flashbacks that flesh out their initial meeting, their courtship, their romance, including a very, very daring close-up of what is actually two men kissing, there is a sense that the traveller, although technically correct in foretelling or predicting doom, is actually missing the whole thrust of the meaning of his friend's life. The problem with this in Shinoda's film is that the fact that we had been seeing the narrative through his eyes to a certain extent, it means that the fact that we are ultimately somewhat in opposition to his views means that there is a kind of lack of enough real emotional connection or investment when we have the final deluge, where we have, spoiler alert, the breaking of the imprisonment of the princess and the ironic flooding of the village. When we get this, and when we are left with the traveller as the sole survivor, and we see him looking on as the princess ascends to claim her freedom at the very end of the film, it's not quite as involving and moving as it should be, because we are in effect seeing this through the eyes of a character who's hinted at conversion or change of mind doesn't really take root, isn't really substantial enough to convince or to involve us. Conversely, in Miike's film, which is very bare, I've talked about emotional and character-based abstraction. Visually, the mise en scène is very abstract. There is very little on stage. There is an appropriation through, or an approximation through light of a stream. There is the front of a house, the friend and his maiden wife's house, and there is the place where the bell is housed, and the rest of the film takes place entirely on a bare stage. And this abstract suggestion of a village or a location remains firmly in place throughout Miike's film. Indeed, this is even the case when temporal planes, different temporal planes, come into being. Miike himself uses flashbacks, ostensible flashbacks, not to the courtship I mentioned in Shinoda's film, rather to the moment when the estranged friend encounters the dying bell ringer and agrees to take over the ringing of the bell and the upholding of the tradition. At this point, the characters who are part of the flashback, who are part of an earlier time in the story, all mass onto the stage and share the same physical space. So there is a physical contiguity, even though there is a fracture of the timeline. So the narrative, the structure, is at this point quite intricate. Elsewhere, as I said, everything remains bare, abstract. The flood at the end takes place, but this is all done through suggestion, through characters fearfully looking on and desperately falling over themselves to try and escape. There is no visual rendering of this disaster. So consequently, there is a strong sense of, as I've noted, estrangement and alienation. It's almost quasi-Brechtian to the extent that we are made aware of the mechanics of the narrative, of the staging of the play, of the representation of events. We are held at one remove, as Bertolt Brecht idealized with regard to German theatre in the early part of the 20th century. We are not engrossed in the material. We are left to our own devices to think about staging, to think about performance, and to reflect on perhaps the political implications of this. These implications are, again, less specific in Miike's version of Demon Pond. In Shinoda's film, an early on-screen series of titles gives us information about Demon Pond and tells us very specifically that the story takes place in 1933. Miike's version has no such information. And indeed, there is almost nothing to actually cue us in to when the drama takes place. And there is no specific year, but there is a sense that it is post-World War II. There is a very important line towards the end when the sacrifice is about to take place and the traveller and his friend are arguing with the villagers about what should happen. Significantly here, the argument is split between broadly left and right-wing politics. The village elder, who is leading the charge to have the maiden sacrificed, argues that Japan as a fatherland needs its citizens to risk and indeed sacrifice all for its greater benefit, its greater good, saying himself that he's ready to die for Japan. The traveller argues back that this, what he terms Bushido ideology, is outdated, and such antiquated practice is not, and certainly should not be, prevalent in contemporary Japan. Again, to which the village elder replies by stating that America, quote, swallowed us up because of soft liberal views like yours. So there is a definite post-World War II discourse here, wherein the right-wing entrenchment and return to older values of Bushido, of samurai, something that was seen quite prominently in Japan in the 1950s and 1960s, something that particularly animated the thinking, the work, and ultimately the life and death of the acclaimed novelist Mishima Yukio, is contrasted with a sense of trying to fit Japan into a more liberal, more democratic, less feudalistic or militaristic mindset. This marked binarism of left and right-wing political views and ideologies is far more overt here than it is in Shinoda's film. The setting of Shinoda's film is, as I said, 1933. At the start of a decade that would ultimately lead Japan into conflict, first with China and then after Pearl Harbor with the US and the Allied powers in the Pacific conflict in World War II. The right-wing militaristic society that was developing throughout the 1930s was still, at least in some ways, embryonic in 1933. So Shinoda, in setting his film in this particular year, updates the discourse of liberalism and Western modes of thought and politics against samurai-like feudalism that was the initial sort of socio-political context of the original play. He updates this to the conflicts and the prevailing political and ideological tensions that were just beginning to gather pace in the 1930s. But it's a little bit too vague to say that there is any kind of real allegory here. I think if one is to ascribe an allegorical meaning and imperative to this narrative, it is Miike's version of the play, version of the story, that most wholeheartedly sort of embraces and foregrounds this aspect, even though, again, other than this very pointed exchange towards the end of the narrative, there's not a lot that suggests allegory. As I've noted, the abstraction, the sense of sparsity, visual, narrative, character-based sparsity in this film means that we sort of pour ourselves into it to fill it up, if you like. And this is where the aforementioned sort of Brechtian imperative comes in. So I think rather than actually offering a loaded view of right and left, where sort of liberal politics is seen to be enshrined or validated, I think Miike is actually wanting us to not become immersed in this debate and take one side over the other, but actually consider the weight of left and right wing political views, or indeed any kind of opposing social or political doctrines. The closest that Shinoda in his Demon Pond gets to this kind of political discourse is an extended subplot in which the villagers are essentially manipulated by a government official from the city. He brings them several bags of rice in order to curry their favour, and it is this official, this urbanite, who, as I said, manipulates and cajoles the villagers, who in both are presented as something of a uniform group of hicks, as it were. He cajoles them into nominating the maiden as a sacrifice and undertaking to physically remove her from her house and sacrifice her. As such, then, there is a much less pointed political discourse and a much less era-specific political discourse in Shinoda's film. In a way, Miike's film and the political discourse already mentioned positions it in line with some of the key debates going on in Japan between the left and the right in the first post-war decades, post-World War II decades. The debates that were raging largely amongst students, among the radical left who were protesting and rioting in the streets, and the increasingly entrenched right wing. This rocked Japan throughout the 50s and 60s in particular. Something that Shinoda lived through, came of age through, certainly as a filmmaker. So it's quite interesting that this finds a more direct and more complete expression in Miike's film rather than Shinoda's film. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why Miike turned to a very youthful cast of protagonists, particularly the traveller, the maiden, and the traveller's estranged friend. The generational conflict between these characters and the more elder village statesman, if you like, suggests again something of the youthful vibrancy, the youthful engagement in political discourse and their social and political disenfranchisement throughout the 1960s and 1970s. In a way, both films are not easily classifiable as political, despite these various pronouncements. I think what animates both films, and I think the question of politics comes into the debate through these means. What animates both films is a questioning, a probing of tradition in Japan, the place of tradition in a country that was in the 1970s and in the early 2000s still undergoing rapid change and still not quite fully conversant with itself. Shinoda made his Demon Pond at the very apex of Japan's economic miracle. Its post-war makeover into a Western capitalist free market economic superpower. That had all ended. That began to collapse in the 1990s, and a very prevalent and powerful recession had hit by the time that Miike made his Demon Pond. So in a way, Miike's film is kind of a mirror image in terms of the socio-political context in which it was made of Shinoda's film. Japan was a gleaming, very rich, very powerful nation in 1979. It would only go on to be more so throughout the 1980s. But by the time of Miike's film, just a little over 20 years later, it was a nation struggling with the after effects of this economic miracle and this affluence. In other words, when it had been taken away, what defined Japan? And so a questioning of tradition, of some of the prevalent myths and historical legends, folk tales, and their place in contemporary Japan and its culture are really what both versions of Demon Pond, indeed the original play as well, are all about. The precise contours of Shinoda's and Miike's films as fables are difficult to pin down because they are in some ways more complex than an outline might seem. The Traveller, who is played in Shinoda's film by Tomu Yamazaki, who would go on to be the leading man of choice for Itami Juzo, is a little bit akin to the male protagonist of Teshigahara's Woman of the Dunes. He's a teacher on an expedition. And just as in Teshigahara's film, the Traveller here becomes entrapped, albeit less literally so, within a remote space by villagers, by a group of people whose interests remain directly in conflict with his own. What's interesting and what is actually reasonably common of Japanese cinema at this time, throughout the late 70s and 80s, there were a number of films, some, in fact, quite a few, by fellow New Wave directors like Oshima Nagisa's Empire of Passion or Imamura Shohei's Palme d'Or winning The Ballad of Narayama, the first ever Japanese film to win the Palme d'Or. These films all probe the place of tradition. Demon Pond itself suggests that a spiritual lineage may in fact be counter to the better interests of humanity, interestingly enough, I think. It suggests that following traditional practices and holding traditional beliefs blindly, as we could argue the Traveller has done in ringing the bell and keeping up that tradition, is actually not to the betterment of all. And we see that with the princess, with that sort of community or culture below the waves of the Demon Pond. I think Miike's film doesn't quite have this thematic meat. I think the arguable potential sort of quasi-Brechtian dynamic that I've alluded to makes any kind of allegorical imperatives a little bit less to the fore. I think they're a little bit less pronounced in keeping with the sort of general textual abstractness of the whole piece. And I think this is where ultimately the difference lies between these two films. Both very interesting in their own right, but it's a question of how forcefully or how overtly the film suggests its kind of thematic undercurrents or subtextual meanings. If you've seen both of these films, or if you've seen only Shinoda's film more recently, comment, drop me a line, let me know what you think of it. I'm always happy to take suggestions in the comments for videos that viewers are kind enough to suggest. Anything you would want me to cover or analyze, please let's get our heads together, and I'm more than happy to take work on board, as it were. So comment, like and subscribe, or don't. Follow me on X at AdamBingham01 for more of my random inane ramblings, and I'll speak to you the next time.